From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Be in no doubt. The United Kingdom and others in this room are watching Russia. We know exactly what they are doing, and we are countering their attacks both publicly and behind the scenes.
Pat McFadden is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He's a very senior figure in the Labour government, responsible for a lot of the activities and goings-on at the Cabinet Office, and he was speaking at a NATO conference focused on cyber issues in central London.
We know from history that appeasing dictators engaged in aggression against their neighbours only encourages them.
And he chose this speech to really call out Russia for some of its aggression and its sabotage in the cyberspace. And specifically what was interesting was he did something quite unusual for British officials. He singled out a specific unit of Russia's GRU military intelligence agency known as Unit 29155.
Together with international partners, we recently publicly exposed a Russian military unit, Unit 29155, which has carried out a campaign of malicious cyber activity against NATO members.
And McFadden said that that was a particularly hostile group that had been responsible for a series of cyber attacks, and we know they've been responsible for a series of other sabotage incidents as well.
The unit has targeted the government services, financial services, transport systems, energy and healthcare sectors of NATO members.
And he used that opportunity to put a little bit more in the public domain about that group.
Let me tell you today, that effort will not succeed.
In terms of cyber interference, he was focusing on the really damaging impact that hostile states can have. And he talked about Russia having the ability to, quote, shut off the lights for millions of people, end quote.
Russian state-aligned groups have taken responsibility for at least 9 separate cyber attacks of varying severity against NATO states, including unprovoked attacks against our critical national infrastructure.
And so he was using this as an opportunity, not to say that this was something that necessarily is imminent in Britain, but it's a capability that the Russians have, and it's something that we need to be more aware of. And he was announcing a new unit that would have some capability to counter that.
The story today: the Russian spies on our streets.
I'm Fiona Hamilton, the chief reporter of The Times.
Fiona, you used to be crime editor here at The Times. How long have you been covering stories about Russian spies and interference?
Well, an element of my role then and now was to cover security. And the security patch has really changed over the decade or so that I've been involved in it, because security traditionally, when I took it on, was very much about terrorism, with the threat of al-Qaeda and the establishment of the Islamic State Caliphate and the impact on Britain and all the terrorist attacks. That was very much a big focus for reporters who cover security issues. Over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that has morphed a bit more into the security threat from hostile states. And actually, when MI5 and other organisations in this space talk about that, they talk about having to switch a little bit to actually have the resources and the capabilities to combat increased threats from hostile states, which obviously include Russia. Russia is the most acute of those, but also China, Iran, and others.
I suppose a lot of people will be wondering, why is Russia acting on the streets of London? Why are they getting so involved with what's happening here? Why are they trying to interfere?
So experts, including military and security officials, see us as being in a bit of a grey zone at the moment, which is that period. It's not a peacetime period. It's a pre-wartime period where we are being subjected to acts of aggression, to sabotage, to cyber aggression, to, in some cases, intimidation of dissidents, and, as we'll come on to, attempted assassinations and successful assassinations of people who are seen as being an enemy to the state of Russia. And obviously in Ukraine, the grey zone no longer exists and it is broken out into open warfare. And it is very much Russia trying to assert its authority and seeing Britain as enabling its allies, such as Ukraine, to defend against it. And I guess in some ways, some of this stuff is a warning shot of what might come in the future.
And let's talk about the group that Pat McFadden singled out. This is the Unit 29155. Catchy title. Who exactly are they? What do we know about them?
So 29155 is a specific unit of Russia's GRU, military intelligence agency. Now, the GRU has been around in different guises for a couple of centuries, but it was formerly called the GRU and established by Joseph Stalin, the former Russian dictator. Now, the GRU, until about 2008, did not include Unit 29155, and it's believed that it was created that year. There was some kind of a coup, and there was a decision to create a specific unit, held about 60 or so operatives, and their specific task was to go around Europe conducting sabotage operations and the more hostile kinds of acts with which we've been now familiar over the last few years. The interesting thing about 29155 is they had been operating for the best part of a decade, but they didn't really become very well known to Western intelligence, or maybe not even known at all, until the 2018 Salisbury Novichok nerve agent attacks.
That is interesting. We'll get onto those in a moment. Before we do, though, do we have any sense of how big this unit is and how it differs from the rest of the GRU? What's their specific remit?
So their specific remit was to conduct hostile acts outside Russia. So going around Europe, sabotage, fires, we can talk about explosions at munitions depots that are seen to be linked to Russia's enemies, intimidation and surveillance of what Russia deems to be hostile actors, such as dissidents, people who are acting against Russia's interests. And they are very much seen as at the coalface kind of group doing the difficult tasks for Putin.
You mentioned Salisbury. That is the moment a lot of people, certainly in this country, became aware of what the GRU and this unit in particular was doing. There's been an inquest recently into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who died as a result of the Salisbury poisonings. I know you've been following the inquest. Just remind us of what happened.
So in Salisbury in March 2018, there was a gentleman living there called Sergei Skripal, and he was visited by his daughter Yulia. He had been an officer in the GRU military intelligence agency, and he had leaked secrets to Western allies, including Britain. He had been imprisoned in Russia, and then he was the subject of a spy swap several years later, and he had gone to reside in Salisbury. And it later emerged that Sergei Skripal was considered a traitor by Vladimir Putin. Agents from the GRU travelled to the UK, and the British government has accused them of placing Novichok, which is a nerve agent, on Sergei Skripal's front door. They became dramatically sick.
This is where that couple were found at about 4:30 on Sunday. This is in the heart of Salisbury city centre, and you can see the police presence behind me there.
Her eyes were just completely white. They were wide open, but just white and frothing at the mouth. And then the man went stiff. His arms stopped moving, but he's still looking dead straight.
And Novichok was dotted around the town of Salisbury in a really quite extraordinary incident.
Sergei Skripal's house cordoned from the public view at ground level. So too the restaurant Zizi, the graveyard where his wife and son lie buried, the Mill pub in Salisbury city centre.
He and Yulia survived, but it was very widely seen as an assassination attempt by the Russian state to warn anybody else against speaking out against its interests.
It was almost miraculous that they managed to survive. They were found in time, they got treatment in time. But there were other victims in the end.
The two latest victims of this deadly nerve agent, originally created by Russia have been identified not by police but by local sources as 44-year-old woman called Dawn Sturgis and 45-year-old Charlie Rowley. Both now are in a critical condition in hospital.
So these Russian agents are believed to have used a perfume bottle, a Nina Ricci perfume bottle, to disguise the nerve agent, which they were carrying around Salisbury. It's believed that they discarded it at some point after the operation. Now, a few months later, it was discovered by a man called Charlie Rowley. He was in a relationship with a woman called Dawn Sturgis. He believed it to be a discarded perfume bottle that still hadn't been taken out of its packaging, he thought. And so he took it home to Dawn, and she sprayed it on her wrists, and she became violently sick, just like the Skripals before her. Charlie Rowley also became very sick, but he recovered. But tragically, Dawn died. And the circumstances of her death, the medical help that she received, the circumstances of the original Salisbury attack, and also the reaction of the authorities and whether enough was done to prevent an innocent member of the public being exposed. All of those issues are being examined by the ongoing inquiry. Now, it's just had several weeks of hearings in open. It's shut down for Christmas, and then it will go into closed hearings because of the nature of the intelligence that is top secret that is going to be heard. And then at some point, probably not until the following year, there'll be a report released.
That will be fascinating when it comes out. In the meantime, when the poisonings happened, quite rapidly, the authorities were able to identify 2 men they thought were responsible. Tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, well, this is all very interesting, and the inquiry got into this a couple of weeks ago in quite a lot of detail. Now, obviously, there were CCTV images of these 2 men walking around Salisbury in the vicinity of Sergei Skripal's home, and so they were pretty quickly, as you say, identified as suspects. And British police put out their images and were calling for further help in identifying them. And then there was some brilliant and absolutely fascinating work done by the open source website Bellingcat and The Insider, which is a partner that it works with often, a Russian independent website, to uncover more information about these operatives, their links to the GRU, and so on. And then there was an extraordinary development where the 2 of them did an interview with the state broadcaster back in Moscow.
We are those who were shown to you in the pictures, Ruslan Bashirov and Alexander Petrov.
Are those your real names?
Yes, they are our real names.
And their real identities had still not been uncovered at this point. But they said that they were in Salisbury as tourists. They'd gone to see the cathedral's famous spire.
Our friends had been suggesting for a long time that we visit this wonderful town.
There's the famous Salisbury Cathedral, famous not only in Europe, but in the whole world. It's famous for its 123-meter spire. It's famous for its clock, the one of the first ever created in the world that's still working.
And it really became an incident that was mocked around the world because what they were saying just didn't stand up to scrutiny at all.
I mean, it was the best ad that cathedral has ever had.
It really was.
For all the wrong reasons.
And the current national head of counterterrorism, a guy called Dominic Murphy, actually told the Novichok inquiry recently that British police were totally floored by this. They couldn't believe it. And in a way, they couldn't believe their luck because they had these 2 men confirming their aliases. And there was information that they could then use to piece together what their real identities were. And so from that, their true identities were unmasked as a colonel in the GRU and a second operative in Unit 29155.
And through that unmasking, we ended up learning quite a lot about how this unit within the GRU works when it's abroad.
That's right, because what they had done is they had used pieces of real information on occasions to apply for visa applications in the UK or across Europe. And sometimes if they were required to put a family member or next of kin down, they may have used a real name. And so there was a real patchwork of information coming in intelligence and in passport offices and in border force agencies across Europe. And that was all put together to establish their real identities. And from that, and from linking all of their travel across Europe, not just these two people, but other people involved in this unit, a real picture of some of the alleged havoc and chaos and destruction that they've caused on the continent, as well as in the UK, emerged. And I should say that, there was a lot of talk about the tradecraft, as it were, of the Salisbury attackers.
Yeah, tell us about that.
And there were so many things at the time, towards the end of 2018, when this all came out, that they had allowed themselves to be identified, that they were clearly very visible on CCTV, that they didn't really have a very good alibi at all for why they were in Salisbury, that they'd done a reconnaissance trip about a year earlier for which they had no good excuse either, and that they had used real bits of their identities on certain visa applications and whatnot.
And their passports were quite suspicious too.
Yeah, they had sequential passports which showed that they had applied for them under fake identities at exactly the same time. And actually, it turns out that the GRU is quite expert in sort of pumping out those kinds of fake passports. But then there was an alternative theory, which is actually that if this was to be seen as a warning shot, that Russia would not necessarily mind, that people ultimately, after the deed had been done, had found out about it. And what we're going to start talking about, the operations, the destabilization operations and sabotage across Europe, they didn't get linked to it for a good many years later. So some might say, well, it was still pretty successful.
I know you've spoken to a lot of people about this unit, 29155. What have people you've spoken to said about it?
I had an interesting conversation with John Foreman, who was the UK's defence attaché in Moscow between 2019 and 2022, so really at the coalface for a lot of the fallout from the Salisbury attack. And he said that 29155 was really liked by Putin because it was a unit that it was high risk, high reward. But he also said it's become a bit of a bogeyman because there's been a lot of publicity attracted to 29155, naturally because of what happened in Salisbury, and then the links that have been made by the authorities and by Bellingcat, the insider, and some other of their collaboration partners in the years since. But that actually it should be seen as a relatively small piece in a much, much larger machinery of what Russia is doing in terms of its threat to Britain. So by that, he means that 29155 is a relatively small unit in the GRU, a massive military intelligence agency that is conducting all sorts of other espionage operations. The GRU contains, for example, Fancy Bear, the cyber hacking unit.
Russian hackers are blamed for breaking into the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign chairman's computers. A Kremlin-backed cyber team known as Fancy Bear has also gone after targets in Europe and Russia.
And then, of course, you have other arms of the Russian state. So there's the FSB agency, most notoriously known in the UK for the 2006 polonium attack on Alexander Litvinenko, who was a dissident living in London, and he died as a result of that. So there is a lot else going on far beyond 29155.
Fiona, you explained how this unit is very high risk, high reward, and so it gets a lot of attention even from the Kremlin. This is Unit 29155. But as you say, there is an entire state apparatus that is also working at disinformation, at interference in different ways with society here in Britain and across Europe. Give us a few more examples of what else we've seen recently. There was a honey trap case. Tell us what you can about that.
So there's an alleged Russian spy ring. Some of the alleged perpetrators are currently on trial at the Old Bailey. A couple of the ringleaders have actually pleaded guilty to spying on behalf of Russia. They're of Bulgarian nationality. And there are two women alleged to have been in a honey trap where they were going to be used to glean information from targets, the prosecution say, and they've pleaded not guilty. And that ring was focused on journalists who were putting information in the public domain that was damaging to Russia and its activities. And there's also allegations that they were focusing on aspects of the Ukrainian military machine as well. And that's probably, a good indication of the type of work the authorities are doing to draw attention to and bring to justice alleged participants in Russia's hostile activities.
Fiona, you've been telling us about some of the Russian spying activity we've seen here in the UK, but it's also happening in other parts of Europe. There's been a big case involving DHL. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is an alleged sabotage operation that authorities in Germany and other European countries have attributed to the Russians again. And it does have an ultimate link back here. So there was a really serious incident at an airfield in Leipzig, which is in East Germany, where a DHL, which is, of course, the courier company, they were loading cargo onto the plane, which is a specific DHL plane that's being flown to different locations to deliver packages and supplies. And before one of the packages was loaded onto the plane, it exploded. Now, there had been an incendiary device planted by somebody into that package. And the implications of that are pretty obvious. If that plane had been up in the air and it really wasn't a delay by very much, and if it had exploded, then that plane would almost certainly, you would think, have come down and life would have been in danger. So the German authorities came out and said that this was a serious security risk and that there had been a sabotage operation going on and it was linked to the Russian state. And then there was an incident that had happened around the same period, but it only came to light a little bit later after the Germans spoke out, that a very similar thing had happened in Birmingham, that a DHL cargo had been targeted in Birmingham and there was an incendiary device there as well. Now, the authorities have been quite tight-lipped about this one. National Counterterrorism Command say that they're investigating. There hasn't been attribution, although we can be pretty sure that they are looking at the Russians for this.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, and it was only about 2 months ago, this all came to light, the DHL sabotage campaign. It came to light just a week after Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, had given his annual threat speech.
And when the head of MI5, Ken McCallum, stood up and talked about the sort of threats he's seeing from Russia, what was he most worried about?
Thank you for joining me today in the Counter-Terrorism Operations Centre, CTOC. Every day, MI5 officers, investigators, agent runners...
So Ken McCallum was giving his annual threat speech. He sort of talks through the waterfront of the security dangers facing the UK. So he talked about terrorism issues, what's going on in the Middle East, and he talked about hostile states, not just Russia and Iran, but he particularly singled out the GRU intelligence agency.
The GRU in particular is on a sustained mission to generate mayhem on British and European streets. We've seen arson, sabotage, and more. Dangerous actions conducted with increasing recklessness.
And that their dangerous actions were being carried out with increasing recklessness, which was clearly something that concerned him. And he urged businesses, particularly those in arms, logistics and transport fields, and with an international footprint, to be prepared for potential sabotage.
The National Protective Security Authority, a part of MI5, already works to strengthen our critical national infrastructure. We want to help others who may be at risk of attack.
So if you're talking about MI5, it's the Domestic Intelligence Agency. They would be very concerned about threats to dissidents on British soil, and they don't talk about that. But I think, I'd be pretty foolish not to think that that might be something that would be investigated on occasion, and that after the Skripal incident, other Russian dissidents weren't warned, and certainly other people are aware of that there is a threat there.
The first 20 years of my career here were crammed full of terrorist threats. We now face those alongside state-backed sabotage and assassination plots against the backdrop of a major European land war.
The campaign of sabotage poses big concerns because of the acute issue of the threat to life, but also the wider issue of the destabilisation effects that might have on the British population. And then ultimately, I suppose, given what's happening in Ukraine and the machinations over NATO and all those issues, and the election of President Trump and what that will mean next year, that would be something that will be highest on the agenda, I guess.
The decisions MI5 has to take on allocating our finite capacity are harder than I can recall in my career. That's true at strategic level, judging how much to devote to immediate threat mitigation and how much on preparing for next year's menaces. It's even more sharply true at the tactical, operational level, as we decide how to prioritise the hundreds of fragmentary leads coming in the door each month.
Now, security officials here, the police here, have not linked the DHL attacks to the GRU, but make of that what you will. There's quite a clear link there in what Ken McCallum was saying and what emerged publicly a week later, that the Russians were believed to have targeted a transport company, DHL, with incendiary devices.
Which is exactly the modus operandi used in Leipzig. Do they know why they pick particular targets? Why they're picking DHL? Is it just to give sort of a sense of chaos? They want people to feel like anything might happen, or is there a particular reason to pick those companies or those targets?
So I've really tried to get a clear answer on this, and it can be sometimes quite difficult because obviously the people I deal with, the police, the government, security officials, tend to be quite coy about ongoing investigations. And also they don't necessarily know and can pinpoint exactly what the motive for this is. But I think if you talk to experts, they would say that it's just to create a general sense of concern and fear in countries like Britain, which are adversaries at the moment to Russia.
Yeah.
It's destabilizing. It adds to people's concerns that things aren't quite right, that things don't work properly, that you could be targeted, that attacks are possible. And if you're an adversary like Russia and you want to sow doubt and fear into a population's minds, then this is one element that probably does quite a good job, the fear that a plane could ultimately go down.
Yeah. So Fiona, that's a whole spectrum of activities that you're seeing, from alleged honey traps to activities that could bring down cargo planes. How well equipped are we to be able to deal with such a multitude of different attacks?
Well, the authorities say that they've become increasingly capable at countering the threat from Russia over the past few years as that threat has got more serious and more aggressive. And certainly I know, say, at policing levels, they've diverted officers from terrorism operations into hostile state operations. And that's a constant balancing act that they have to perform, where they're putting resources into where the threat looms at the moment. In terms of cyber operations, the National Cyber Security Centre was created several years back now. It's an arm of GCHQ, but it is very much about cyber resilience and cyber defence. And they have been going on in a years-long campaign now of raising awareness to industry, to government, to big business in the private sector about having much, much better cyber defences so that you can repel ransomware attacks and that you don't get tricked into malware attacks. So on the cyber front, what I'm being told is that we are in a pretty good position. But when I was speaking to John Foreman and other experts and analysts have sort of said to me is that where we're probably weakest is on that fragility that we were talking about, that sense of fear and the disinformation piece. And as social media becomes more fragmented and people seem less inclined to engage with and believe mainstream media and more inclined to believe what they read on social media, that we are absolutely open to the threat of disinformation and misinformation. And that is perhaps where Russia has had some of its most successful campaigns in the West over the past 5-10 years.
How should we understand what's happening at the moment? I mean, as you said, we're not at war, but it feels a bit like it's everything up to all-out war now. I mean, are we in a state of sort of war?
Yeah, and when I speak to officials like this, they want to make people aware, but they don't want to make it seem like it's apoplectic and we're in this imminent, extreme danger. So I think we're at the phase of that grey zone altercation where people need to be aware that they could be being manipulated. They need to protect their information. They need to be aware that not everything is it seems to be. But certainly we're not right on the precipice of something, or at least let's hope not.
That was the chief reporter for The Times, Fiona Hamilton. You can read more of her coverage on Unit 29155 at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We do read all of them. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.